Welcome, everybody. It's really phenomenal to get to be with you. Oh, sorry. Hang on a second here. There we go. All right. Can't leave that computer audio on. I'm Matt Peoples. It's great to be with you on today's webinar where we're going to be talking about training church planters. And we're here with Steve Pike. If this is the first time you're meeting Steve, you know, I intro you all the time. You've probably heard my spiel, but Steve was the founder of Church Plant Multiplication Network. He did that. They planted over 2,000 churches while he was there. And now he does a thing called Urban Islands Project, where he trains people to plant in hard to reach places and difficult places to plant churches. And his experience with church planting and seeing church plants and training church planters is just amazing. And so last couple weeks, he blew our mind with some of the different pools that you can find. And then the obvious shallow pools all the way into the deep pool and the distant pool. And if you missed that, you're going to want to go back and watch that webinar. But the webinar was so good and that content was so rich that we didn't have time to talk about training. So right. What do you do when you finally have that person you're ready to train as a church planter, and what's the best system for that? So Steve, if you could, there's been a predominant model. Yeah. If I'm correct, for training church planters. What is that predominant model that's kind of been in existence?
Yeah. Here's the thing. First of all, I'm just glad that people are being trained. When I started a church 30 years ago, it was pretty much just, if God's called you to plant a church, go for it. And there was nothing. There's like one book maybe 30 years ago, which is odd because, I mean, church planting was happening, but boy, it was definitely the school of hard knocks. And so, you know, the fact that the tradition, that the model emerged, that we're now saying maybe we need to give it a relook, that model was not a bad thing. It was a good thing. And it was, so I just want to start off by saying I'm not against the traditional model, but here's what it is. The idea was, boy, we got to stop sending people out there with just nothing. And so what do they need to know? And so, you know, people that were overseeing the training of church planters, you know, came up with a list of all this stuff you need to know. And they said, what's the best way to deliver it? Well, let's get them all together. And maybe in 2, 3, at the most 4 days, but some far less than that. Sometimes it's only a day and a half or something. Basically just dump a truckload of information on top of the church planters, and that covers everything from A to Z. It was pretty comprehensive, but it was pretty overwhelming too. And that's, so, you know, those were called boot camps, church planting training events, church planting intensives, which is a good name for it because it was super intensive. And, the theory was that you basically get all that information to them, and then over however long it takes, the next year or so, they're going to apply all that information.
Well, and I love how you talk about how that was a great step forward, because I remember talking to a planter, Norm Grodelution, graduated seminary 50 years before I did, and his first plant was in Oklahoma, and he drives into a pastor's church who is the mission exec, and he says, okay, what do I do? He hands him a stack of note cards and a pencil, and he says, go meet people. 1 month later, the church is planted, still here today. So God does stuff, but he would even tell you, man, I wish we had some of that stuff in place.
Right. Because I guarantee you, you just told his story in one sentence, that, you know, he went out with a stack of contact cards, and then 30 years later or 50 years later, whatever, the church is still going. But I guarantee you there's some pain that he went through that, you know, it was just the pain of discovery. And, you know, I had the same, sort of a similar experience. I had, you know, it was a school of hard knocks, and I spent about 2 or 3 years kind of getting my head beat against the ground, trying to figure out how to really get the thing going. And, you know, after 3 or 4 years, we did figure it out, and the church that I started is still going today. But it's, you know, I pretty quickly realized, man, there's a bunch of stuff that that I didn't need to learn through the school of hard knocks. You're already fighting the devil. So you don't need to add other opponents on top of the devil. So let's remove as many opponents, as many unnecessary opponents and obstacles as we can. And that's what training's really about, is, you know, we want to set you up. The best way to set you up for success is to make sure that we're eliminating obstacles that will add to the actual fact that the enemy is trying to stop you from doing this. So if we can make him the only opponent, then we've got, God will take care of him.
So, and I love that, because kind of what you're saying with the whole, we moved to the boot camp phase. So we were really helping people. I like to call it helping people not have to pay the stupid tax.
Right.
Right.
That was the idea.
If I paid it, I don't want you to have to pay it, kind of
Right.
thing. And so coming up with the list of competencies and stuff sounds like a good thing, because you're really trying to help people understand,
Yeah.
What do you need? It sounds like one of the maybe two difficult spots I see is the boot camp model of just 4 days at the most, and you've got what you need.
Right.
Go with God.
Right.
And I think the other difficulty, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but it sounds like if you're doing it in that style, you definitely have a one size fits all mentality to planting. So here's the playbook,
Yeah.
run this
Right.
playbook.
Yeah. And honestly, I will say that I think people have tried to modify that. So they've gone, there's really two ways of doing the one event church planting training. And one way is that you train to a model, and the other way is you train to principles. Okay. So early on, there was kind of a one size fits all model that everybody's being trained to. And actually, in some ways, that lends itself better to a one-off event, because it's okay, here's 10 steps to starting a church.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is, those models increasingly just don't work, in an increasing number of places. So over the last probably 15 years, church planting organizations have shifted away from a one-size-fits-all model-based training to a principle-based training, which is better in one sense, but it's also, now you're introducing people to these principles and expecting them to just really absorb the principle appropriately, and then contextualize it into the place where they're going, without really, the idea of principle based doesn't really give people a playbook to work from. They basically say, here's the principles, you go figure out what you need to do, and they're still on their own. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So here's what I think would be helpful for this conversation is to just take a minute and sort of do a flyover of how do we set church planners up for success? What are the things that they need to know? And then we can ask the question, is it really smart to try to do that in one event? So let me just kind of bullet list these are the I'm going to give you 5 categories of knowledge, and maybe even just knowledge and questions that church planners need to answer to be successful. And so the first one is the discovery channel, or the discovery category, needs to be transferred, and that's just information about the missional need. I mean, people need to be informed about why they're going to have to answer the question to donors and even to themselves. Why do we need another church? So they need to be equipped with just general knowledge about, well, there's 60 bajillion people in the world, and not everybody's following Jesus, and we're not done with the Great Commission yet. So, but the point is, they need good information about that, but they need just good information about general principles of church multiplication, just so they're familiar. I mean, again, sometimes people, if you've never been involved in starting a new church, you've got to at least have a flyover of, what are my options for how do I do this kind of stuff. And so, and then you also, honestly, in the discovery phase, you need to discover a sense of calling. I think it's really important that church planners that are in training have come to a place where they have a high degree of certainty that God is calling them to this, because it's definitely not for everybody. And so I think in this discovery category, this is early on, somebody needs to arrive at the conviction where, wow, there's a need for church planting. I've got an idea of, what that might look like. And I really feel like God's calling me to move in this direction. So that's the discovery category. Okay.
Well, and I've heard different ways that people express that. Like, and I've love-hate relationship with some of the ways it's expressed. Like, people have said things like, you plant because you just can't do anything else. Well, I think you can do other things, but you really just want to plant that bad. And people also say, they'll kind of go the other way, and they'll say, planting's a hard way to die.
Right.
To be
Yeah,
honest, I agree with some of those things, but I think at the heart is what you're saying, which is
yeah,
just you need to know that this is what you need to do, because even with all the best training and the best coaching,
right,
you're going to hit challenges because you
right.
have an enemy that doesn't want to see this
And,
happen.
and honestly, I mean, it's Jesus is the one who's building his church, and he gets to choose who's going to help him, you know. And sometimes what I've seen happen is people in a discovery phase will realize I'm not supposed to be the key catalyst.
Hmm.
I'm supposed to help start a church, but I'm not supposed to be the key catalyst. So this is what I'm talking about, you know, wrestling around. And honestly, this, I think you have to start with a sense of calling and let the rest of the process refine that. But it does need to be, you know, you're not starting a business, you're not starting a social club, that this isn't really built around what your interests are. These are built around the mission of Jesus and what his interests are. And so there has to be, at the end of the day, like you said, because it's hard and because you know, I've said this before, it's one part strategy and one part miracle.
Yeah.
And if all you've got is the strategy, you're going to fail. And the miracle part contains this calling piece. You know, it's that divine calling from God, and you just, that needs to be present, that needs to be always factored in through this whole thing. Okay, so that's the first chunk of
Hmm.
stuff. And a lot of times you go to these boot camps or whatever you want to call them, and that will be part of what's being conveyed. Is they'll they dump a truckload of information and knowledge and tell you to pray about, is God really, so they try to do this in this, you know, okay, we got a half an hour to get this
Yeah.
covered, you know. And so,
Pray
all
really
right,
hard for that next half
yeah,
hour and
yeah,
come
yeah,
back
yeah.
convinced.
And hopefully God shows up and confirms it. Whatever. Okay, I'm being a little facetious, but so then you go. Then the second category of questions and information that needs to be, people need to be trained in, is what I call the discernment category. They need to discern several things, and for me, the best way to get at this stuff is in the form of questions. So in the discern category, it'd be, where or to whom am I being sent? In other words, you don't just go start a church. You decide, somehow you decide on usually a physical location, or at least a physical proximity, or a group of people. You know, we're gonna reach everybody in this neighborhood that speaks Spanish. That's their only language they speak. And so we want to start a church that reaches. So that's what I'm talking about. So it's, where or to whom am I being sent? And number two question in this thing is, how will I be funded? And again, it's well, the next question, I don't want to get stuck on these. Who will help me is another one. Who's going to help? So again, we're not even there yet, and we're already needing to be asking these questions. Um, where or to whom am I being sent? How will I be funded? Who will help me? How will I make the transition from where I am now to where God is taking me? That's a really important question. I mean, if you're on the staff of a church, you really need to be thoughtful about how you make that transition, and in a way that is honoring to the place that you'll be leaving from, and it's healthy for your family. You know, so sometimes people, again, the mentality is, God called me to start a church. You march into the pastor's office or your boss's office and say, I quit and I'm going to go plant a church. Not a smart thing. Again, I'm exaggerating the
Yeah.
extreme, but you know, so during this discernment phase, notice those first two phases, you're not even anywhere near actually doing the stuff that you need to do to get a church going. These are just like preliminary foundations, and they're really important. You know, you and I think we've talked about the 5 funding streams that need to be cultivated for a church to be financially sustainable in the current economic realities that we're facing. And so you need to start really early on thinking about that funding question, as well as, you know, who are some people around me right now that I can invite to be with me on this journey, that are going to be assets on that journey. And so this is even before, you know, if we're thinking about so while we're talking about this, think about, when should this traditional boot camp approach be inserted into this process. Just, I'm going to answer that in a minute, but just be thinking about this. So then you go to what the third category is deploy, which is, this is where now you've actually moved into the community where you're going to be planting the church, if you weren't already living there, or you are now beginning to activate. Maybe you've been preparing, but now you're ready to activate. And so here's some questions that have to be attended to during this process. One of those questions is, what is the story of this place? In other words, you're in a context here. What's the story here? What kind of a place is this? Is it upscale? Is it down and out? Is it marginalized? Does it have a tortured past? Does it have a legendary past? What are all the factors that make this up? And then what are the cultural obstacles to the gospel being seen and heard? In other words, you need to pay attention to why there's X number of people here, and there's a bunch of them who are not following Jesus. What's keeping them from that? What are those things? You got to take time to figure that out. So this is in this deploy phase where you're actually deployed into the situation. And then how will we make disciples here is a huge question. Like, what does that look like? How will we know disciples are being made? If we decide to make disciples, how will we know that's happening? What are we going to use to measure that? So now we're arriving at once you've answered all those questions I just suggested, then you can say, what model are we going to use as a guiding framework? So this starts to highlight one of the problems with what we were talking about earlier, the one-size-fits-all training. What that does is it causes people to move into a context with a model already determined.
Yeah.
And so what's way better to do is to be in that context for a while, answer these questions, and then look for a model that matches the framework, that provides a good framework for that situation you're in.
Well, and I'm really glad you bring that up, because boot camps, books, and conferences do this a lot. Not even intentionally.
Right.
But they give guys a sense of like, well, this is my model, then this is the place I'm going, let's do it. And what I love that you're saying, and that's really important that you need to be looking out for if you're training somebody to plant, is make sure they're not holding too tightly to a model. I've got a friend in Knoxville who trained in Stephen Furtick's church, and then moved to Knoxville and said, this is how we're doing it. And I watched him over the series of years slowly transition that model to something that was much better for the area, much better for him as a leader, and would lead to making more disciples. But, when he first stepped in, it was like, this is the model. We're going with it. And instead of saying, okay, here are the tools you need to plant, asking those contextualization questions, those discipleship questions, as you said, the measure question, because oftentimes we build a strategy, or we teach people to do a strategy without asking them what they're going to make. It's like building a factory and then looking at the factory and saying, hey, we finished the factory. Now, what is it we want to make again?
Right. Yeah. So it's that Stephen Covey thing about begin with the end in mind, and if you start with the end in mind, then you know what you need to measure, and to do to hit that target. So one of the things I want you to start to see, if you think that all the stuff I'm talking about is there's training that can happen to help people through the knowledge and the questions that they need to ask in each of these categories. But again, if you start with a model you're in the discovery phase, and you just decide, okay, I'm going to do this, then where am I going to be sent? You've already got this model telling you, you're really getting things out of order. And you're exactly what you just said about your friend. That's a all too common story. In fact, it's really the most common story. If people are honest, they start out with this one size fits all model and then have to modify it. And so they spend a number of years basically being handicapped by a model that doesn't fit.
Yeah.
And it's actually, in the long run, it's actually more time efficient and missionally efficient to start with these missional questions, like how do we make disciples here, what what are the obstacles that are stopping people from knowing Jesus. I mean, the sort of the idea that the church is a really great, well produced worship service and teaching moment is answering a problem that maybe a lot of Christians have, but a lot of pagans aren't really worried about not having access to a really good worship service and great teaching. That's not what they're looking for. And so just creating something they're not looking for is not that there's, so you have to start. That's why asking this question, what's stopping people from knowing Jesus? And
And this
then
is,
it starts to answer the question, like, what do we need to do to help move people toward him? Yeah.
so we've talked discernment, we've talked contextualization, we've
Yeah.
talked, model, and measures and then model. So what else is, and
Yeah.
this is all, I hope you guys are catching this. This is all stuff you need to learn and know before you even begin to open the doors on a worship service,
Right. Right.
or the
Yeah.
proverbial doors of the church. What would you
Yes.
say are those last couple things?
So, yeah. So now, again, I would suggest that, well, here, let me give you the last two. And these are, if you're following the sequence, I mean, so what we just described, okay, now you're in the neighborhood and you're learning about the neighborhood and now you've identified your model. The next phase is actually develop, is what I call it, which is when the model is deployed or the strategy is activated. And again, so often that's called your launch point. That's the word that's used, but increasingly I'm shifting the language I'm using for the startup of a church to be more around emerging, the church emerging. Because if you follow out what you do in the deploy phase is you're thinking about how do we help people move toward faith in Christ, and that's more of a process, not an event. It's sort of, and so it doesn't mean that you're not going to have a moment when you do something for the first time that gathers everybody together, but that might not be the main thing. But anyway, the point is what happens after that. And so the question is, now that you've got your strategy and you're activating that strategy, now in the develop phase, you ask these questions: what organizational habits or systems do we need to develop that will keep us focused on making disciples? Because that's the core activity of the church. So the question is not, the question is always focused on how do we stay focused on making disciples? Because
Yeah.
ironically, the way that we've sort of been taught that the church is kind of a worship service that happens once a week, and that's the main centerpiece of everything, versus a lifestyle of discipleship and empowering people to be on mission 24/7. And yes, part of that would include coming together and being trained and taught to follow Jesus. So anyway, what do those organizational habits look like that we need to put in place to keep us on track with making disciples? Another question that needs to be answered in the develop phase is, how will we make our disciple making processes sustainable? In other words, making sure that whatever your habits are, that's sustainable financially, it's sustainable from an energy standpoint. You can't, for instance, you could say, okay, we're going to have a disciple making seminar every night for a year. Okay, that's probably not going to be sustainable. You might start off with some energy around that, but after a couple of weeks, I think people are going to start dropping out and you're going to run out of content and all this stuff. So I'm just being a sort of creating, but the point is, it's got to be sustainable. It's got to be, and then how are we developing and sending leaders? This needs to be, because at this stage, you're activating your model, but you've got to think about, for this thing to be healthy, it can't just be a one man or a one person show. We've got to develop leaders to to lead the different aspects of all these different habits that we're developing and stuff. People need to take ownership and things like that. And we need to be developing leaders who can in turn be sent, which brings us to the final category we need to be thinking about is the duplicate category. How will we duplicate this process in another place? And it's really popular nowadays for, I mean, now everybody's heard plant a church that's pregnant, and so that's what everybody says. It's like, I love it. They're like, well, Steve, we're not going to just start one church. We're going to set in motion a multiplication movement. And I think that's wonderful. But then the way they act is not, it doesn't produce that, because for that to really become a reality, you really have to embed multiplication into everything the church is about, which goes back to that disciple making disciple thing being at the very foundation of a church. And out of that is leaders creating leaders or developing leaders. And out of that is the church is sending leaders out who then replicate or reproduce or duplicate the process. So,
well, and I hope you guys are catching this, because, number one, a big point Steve's making that you need to catch is that there's a lot of stuff you have to grab a hold of in training that you don't want to find out the hard way, because then you end up 2-3 years down the road and you have to, it's like building a house without knowing what you're doing. You get down the road, you'd have to tear it down and rebuild, and
right.
And I think the other thing you're catching is the questions. I think a big part of training is teaching the people you're training to ask the right questions. Because I think a lot of times we ask the wrong question, and the right answer to the wrong question is still the wrong answer. And right. So a part of training is this big piece. And so, Steve, you asked the question, and I thought it was a brilliant question. Where does the boot camp fit?
Yeah.
And to be honest with you, I think the boot camp is a great discernment tool, but I don't think it goes much beyond discernment. I think it can give you discernment, and then it can give you almost like a survey of different models. So you've got kind of a bunch of different starting ideas in your mind,
right,
that can then take you the rest of the way. But outside of that, if you're looking at the boot camp model to really train and deploy planters, I don't think it's going to be very effective with the majority of guys going out to plant. It could be really effective helping them discern, but not necessarily getting everything they need to plant.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're onto something there. So honestly, if you really think about it, I don't know if you went whatever thing you went through, but I know I actually used to try to do this. I used to try to cover all that stuff. Like I said, even anybody that's been through a recent boot camp or training experience event will already be talking about multiplication or duplication. So they cover that. They'll already be talking about, part of every training is, how is your church going to be structured? What's the calendar going to look like? That kind of stuff. Everybody's going to be talking about, how do you gather people? How do you, that's so deploy is going to be covered. Discern, they're talking about who are you and who are you being sent to? That's part of every training. And even the discovery thing is included, where, we're making the big case for why we need more churches. So that we've literally, so when the question, where does the boot camp belong in all of that? And the answer is it doesn't. It's too, there's just no, you were trying to struggle with the answer there. It was like, really, it doesn't fit anywhere in any of that. It's just, there's too much to cover. And so,
and I'd even point out, even the areas you talked about are really broad areas that break down even further. Because, one of the things that we do is we have a church plant pipeline process that we train people through. And so when Steve's talking about some of these areas, I'm sitting there thinking about our church planting process and the 3 or 4 areas that fall underneath each of those other areas that are popping in. So.
Yeah, we're just like tapping the top of the mountains here. There's a whole lot of stuff. So
then before we move on to what you're saying, William Robinson asks, what is your definition of a boot camp?
Well, I guess it's, yeah, again, we're using that word generically to
Mhm.
describe the idea that you have this one event where you come in one end of it, and basically all of the stuff we just talked about in one shape, way, form, or another is kind of dumped on you in more of a, usually it's done in a information transfer format, because there's
Mhm.
so much to cover. We don't have time to have too much dialogue about it. And so it's more, people getting up and telling you this stuff. And so anyway, it's delivered in this one short period of time. And I realize there's all kinds of variations to this, and
Mhm.
there's other, people have modified this, trying to make it more adult learning oriented, more interactive oriented. But again, the problem is you just run out of time to
Mhm.
cover everything you need to in the depth. And here's the biggest problem is, eh, you know, it the fastest that this is all going to roll out. But again, if he's wanting the definition of a boot camp, it's the concept, it's the philosophy that it's possible to have a one event,
Mhm.
focused, concentrated event that delivers everything somebody needs to know about starting a church in just one event, and then you're on your own from there. That's
Right.
kind of the concept. And again, I am totally aware most organizations, we're sort of exaggerating sort of the worst case scenario to make the point that the basically the idea that necessary training for all of this can happen in one event is not properly connected to reality.
Right. So what
It's not.
let's
Yeah,
move in then to, because we were talking earlier, and I think how you would suggest um how you would suggest training a church planter.
yeah,
I
yeah,
think that's what I want
yeah.
you to share, because it's just
So
amazing what you
so let me
suggest.
let me summarize the difference between the two, to start with a really simple idea, and that is, the I would say the dominant traditional, the boot camp idea is an event,
Mhm.
and I'm suggesting that the future of training is a structured conversation. Okay, so the difference between an event happens, it has a start and a finish, and it's done. A structured conversation goes on, and there's intentionality, there's structure to it, but it's more of a conversation, it's more of a dialogue. And so here's the thing: if you go back to our list, discovery, discern, deploy, develop, duplicate, the way that I shared that, there is kind of a sequential suggestion there that you don't start with duplicate, because that's not where people aren't even ready to think about that yet. And it's not wrong to say, at the end of this process, we definitely, give them a vision for the future that we're going to do everything we can to help you be the leader of a church that is starting other churches. So it's okay for them to have that idea be planted. But you're not going to go deep in the weeds on how the church becomes a multiplying church, because that's not what right now, they don't even have any people. you know?
Right.
They don't
Well,
even know where they want to go yet.
and I
So
think too, when you talk in terms of an ongoing conversation, I think I love what you're saying, because when I hear what you're saying, what I hear is church plant training can be done in much more of a discipling style
yeah,
relation.
yeah. So I would start by changing the word from a boot camp or something like that. I still think there's a place, quote unquote, for events, but
Mhm.
I think we need more events, shorter, spaced out longer. And the great thing is nowadays, because of, we've all, I mean, we're on Zoom or whatever it is right now. We've all been, kind of forced into this online world. But the great thing about that is this, again, the paradigm in the past is we had to all fly into the same city
Mhm.
and be part of this one big event. And I still think I'm looking forward to the day when we can do stuff like that again. I'm not saying that's wrong or even not necessary, but here's the thing. If we start moving the training, and let me start, so let's call it an orientation event. And I would even say, so you could have, like, we're going to do a 1 hour Zoom orientation to the discovery phase. So all of you that are just kind of going, I don't know if I'm supposed to plant a church or not, This is for you.
Mm.
And during that discovery phase session, you're going to have, and it's going to be information transfer. It won't be a conversation at that point. It'll be dumping
Yeah.
information into everybody's brains that then you follow up with interactive conversations around that information. And so you say, okay, we want everybody who's like just not even sure if they're supposed to plant a church or not, but is willing to entertain the thought, you come to this one-time event, and then we're going to have follow-up conversations. And so that's the ongoing, that's the structured conversation. And those would be in the form, what we do with the Urban Islands Project, we call them cohorts. It's a familiar term in the academic world, but it's a group of people who are kind of traveling along together, and they're gathered because they have similar interests, whatever it may be. If they're academic cohort, we're all working on this same research project together, and it's a research cohort, whatever. So that in the case of these, it would be, okay, we're going to do a discovery cohort for the next, whatever, you pick the
Right.
time, but it might be like 6 months, and we're going to have 6 conversations um, after the orientation. So you do the orientation where you say, this is what we're going to be talking about over the next 6 months. You give them maybe some stuff to read. Say, okay, before the next conversation, read this. Then you get everybody together and say, okay, let's talk about why do we need to plant churches, and what have you discovered in your reading, and what have you heard, and they're okay. So now you're giving them time to process and activate, and you need to have a sense of calling. How's that? How are you pursuing a sense? Is God calling you this? How do you know? We talk about that. How do you know? How does God speak to us? And help them wrestle through some of that stuff. And
Well, what I love that you're talking about is, when you're talking about training somebody to plant a church, you hear Steve describing this way. And what I love is, as Steve's describing that, I'm thinking through the Kairos Network. We train church planters. We train in cohorts. I love training cohorts because you get a small group together, and you really get to do kind of the planting journey together. And it creates a longer term relationship as well, which is huge. But I think the cool thing Steve describes in this process is what's called a transformational learning style. And I think the big thing we have to realize is you have to, if you're training church planters, you have to flip out of the academic model, because the academic model is going to be 70% book learning, 20% one-on-one mentorship, and roughly 10% do. Whereas transformational learning style flips that whole paradigm on its head. So it's 10% book learning, 20% one-on-one mentorship, and then 70% doing. So as Steve's describing, like, hey, we're going to do this cohort together, discovering planting. I'm going to have you read through somebody's planting journey, and then we're going to talk about it. But then I want you to spend time praying through it. And, you're really getting people to do the work, and transformational learning styles are actually better for adult learning in general.
Absolutely. You got to activate people's brains, and your brain is like barely registering when you're just sitting there listening to somebody talk. I mean, even what we're doing right now it's the worst thing would be just for me just to talk for an hour and you not interact at all, but the dialogue itself just bumps up the learning, because you're saying stuff out loud that other people are thinking, and forcing us to talk. So anyway, but here's the thing. You're right. And what we do with our cohorts is, at the end of every cohort session, we give everybody that's on the call what we call an essential activity based on what the conversation focus for the night was. We say, okay, we've been talking about this, you've been exposed to these different ideas. Here's your essential activity between now and the next time we get together. Do this, and it'll be something that is relevant, and it's an assignment that has a clear thing. And the way we say it is, it may not be the thing that right at this moment you feel like is the most important thing that you want to care about, but it is something you are going to need to figure out, and you need to figure it out for your context. So take advantage of this moment to do that. And so I'm just finding way more powerful, like you say, it's transformational versus the outcomes that I see when people just go through these events where it's just spraying information at them and then go, okay, you got the manual, God bless you. Hope it works out,
Well, and
Um,
if you're, you're probably on this webinar because you want to be able to train people. You're starting to catch the process. So a couple of things to highlight here that I think are really encouraging is you don't need the big event to start training church planters.
right,
In fact, highly relational is already going to be better. So if you're sitting there going, well, I'm not putting together an event. Yeah, but if you've got one or two people that have potential to plant and you want to start pouring into them, you can. And
right,
the questions you're trying to answer are, what are the key things they need to know? And there's some
right,
great resources out there. In fact, you don't need the big event because a lot of the big event stuff's already out there on YouTube and,
right. Yeah,
books, and you can grab a hold of that stuff. I'd encourage you, if you want to see, and the other thing Steve described that I thought was helpful is if you've got a small cohort, focus on focused conversations with an intentional track that builds. So leadership pipeline style, it builds on each thing. So like, for example, when we're doing church plant training at the Kairos Network, we start gospel centered,
right,
then moves into spiritual vitality, which then
right,
moves into, discipleship, which then, and
right,
so each thing is intentionally building on the other. And then we get into contextualization, and the skills
right.
are designed to build together with the process. And then what we
Exactly.
do is we send them home with that kind of homework.
Yeah,
And it's a really simple model, which is, what are we going to talk about? Let's discuss, let's do.
right, right. Absolutely. Yeah. So that's, yeah, the beauty of what we're talking about. I'm just talking about a framework of how you create a learning environment and a training environment. Because, the thing is, training, there is, like, again, we talked about this earlier. You want to help people avoid unnecessary, they
Mhm.
don't have to make the same mistakes over and over again. So there are some things that, can be delivered. Training is saying, okay, look, there's 1,000 people that have been down this path before. About 3 steps down the hall, there's a big hole. So you don't need to fall in that
Yeah.
hole. 700 people already did, and now there's
Yeah.
signs up saying don't fall in this hole. So that's the value of training. But what we've discovered is that, just telling somebody that is often not enough, because they forget the message by the time they get down the hall, and they still fall in the hole. So that's why creating this environment where you intentionally say, we're going to get together whether we think we need it or not, and we're going to be revisiting some of the stuff. So here's the thing. I would even suggest, like, you just laid out a framework. I think you said you have like 4 major areas that you pass along. You start with the gospel, and then you go
Yeah,
to,
we and if you want to see it, you guys can download the Kairos Network mobile app and see our
yeah.
church plant training in there. But
So
yeah, we do like a pre-planter, and then we do entering the field. So
yeah,
here's what you need is you're starting to enter the field. Then we do planter. So now you're in the
right.
field, and the church is actually planting. And
Perfect.
then we do
Yeah.
trainer, and yeah.
So I don't know. I have zero idea about exactly how that's being delivered, but what I would suggest is, whether it's the things you just described, or some, again, people just pick your categories. But for me, you could say, okay, discovery, discern, deploy, develop, duplicate. Those are 5. Each one of those contains a bunch of stuff, and so we'll have an orientation for each one of those. So you do an orientation where you say, okay, we're going to be talking about this for the next period of time, 6 months, a year. Some of these things really take a year to process through, because it's just how real life works. And so, you need to build even the timing of the training. So a lot of times we think of training as this one-time event that happens, and then over the next, 2, 3, 4 years is when the church lays out. What I'm suggesting is the training is actually delivered over that 2, 3, 4 year time frame, and you do it by saying, okay, start with, like you said, pre-planter. That's probably sort of analogous to the discovery and maybe discern thing. Whatever your languages are, whatever your categories are, instead of having all of that crammed into one event and you just fly over it and then leave them, you say, let's spread this out over. And like you said, the other benefit is it doesn't have to be a huge group of people. So if you've got, 3 to 5 people, and the good thing is they don't even have to be in the same
Yeah.
zip code.
And
They can be spread out.
I love Andrew's question here because this gets into, because I want to ask you what your rhythm is. But Andrew asked, do either of you guys utilize online videos to cover any of your content you want to deliver, similar to online classes? I know we do. That's kind of one of the keystones in our app is we mix
I
in
think you're building that right
video,
now, right?
yeah, links with, yeah, we're building this video will be in our training, in the higher levels of training. But we do utilize that. I think whenever you're thinking of the content side, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too, Steve, think of the content side as a little bit information and a lot conversation starter.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. No, absolutely. Anytime. Uh, well, so to answer yes, video, having a library that people can access, and that the trainer can, as you're setting up, okay, we're going to be talking about the question of how do we make disciples here. Okay, so that's in one of the categories that I just described, is that's a question. Okay, so that's going to be the focus of one session. So what are some videos, or what are some resources that either we have in our library, or that we can just point them to out there? Like one of the ones I love in that particular question is The Speed of God. It's a great video. If you just do, or God, yeah, it's The Speed of God, I think is what, and and it's a great story about this Anglican guy that learned he learned that the speed of God is 3 miles an hour, because it's the average speed that somebody walks. And when you're walking, you're encountering people and you're having conversations with people. And so it's just a beautiful idea about disciple making being something that just accompanies a simple activity of life of just walking down the street, and how you turn that in.
And that's what's so huge about training, because nowadays there are so many great resources out there, so many great free resources. Something you'll see
Yeah.
us do in our app is we develop content like we're doing right now. We also grab videos that have made an impact on us off YouTube, books, articles, blog posts, put them all in one spot. The key, I think, when you're building is what are the core things that you want to get across to somebody? What's the rhythm you want to do that in, and how often do you want to meet? And so this is a question I've got for you, Steve, is in training, you said you're breaking it down over several years. How often within that year, what's your meeting rhythm when you're training someone?
Yeah, well, yeah, and I think that probably could be a different answer for everybody, but what we're finding to be effective is once a month. So we'll do the orientation. A month out after the orientation, we have the first follow-up to whatever the orientation was about. But there's one other feature that we include that is, I think, really important, because you've got people, even as much as you try to sort of gather people into clusters or groups of people who are at a similar place, it's pretty much impossible to keep everybody aligned. Even if they all start out as completely clueless, just starting out with, they don't know anything about church planning, even if they all start there, they're not going to progress at the same speed in terms of their journey and their story. And so that inevitably you're always going to have this disconnect between what you're talking about, even though, so my goal is to make it more in alignment than there's this phrase in the business world called just-in-time training. And instead of teaching somebody something that they're not going to apply for another 6 months, you teach them something that they're going to do the next day, And so the timing of the training is a factor. And so it's not really that helpful to talk to somebody who's getting ready to go move into the community and start building connections with people. They don't need to spend a lot of time thinking about church organizational structure yet. That is an important subject. It will be important to them one day, but right now they're just going, how do I even start to get in touch with people in the first place? That's the training they need right now. Okay. So one of the benefits of spreading this out is it gives you a better chance of lining up with where they're really at. You're going to be closer to where they're really at. However, even in the best scenario, you're still not going to be right on the nose. So you might be talking about something in the session that they've actually already figured out. They've already stubbed their toe and broken a bone or two, and they're like, okay, yeah, I learned that lesson. Yeah, he's right. Yeah, pay attention. But so for them, this particular session might not be that relevant, but they still are invited to go ahead and be part of that and be reminded. I'm like, oh yeah, that's right, boy, I want to make sure I don't do that again. And they have that essential activity. But here's where it gets really cool with the way we do it. We add, so once a month we have this group thing that and we drive the agenda. This is what we're going to talk about, because whether you know it or not, you need to think about this. But then at another time, they have a one-on-one coaching conversation with a coach, and they bring the agenda. So the thing we had them think about might have, how do you make disciples, but they really want to talk about, how do I fund? That's what they're freaking out about right now. We're not talking about that in this session, but they can bring it up with their coach. They're like, hey, I've got this opportunity, or I've got this or that, help me think this through. So what that does is, again, it provides a support, a just in time needed. And the coach can say, okay, you know what, there's 10 videos that you can go to that will help you right now with that. So what we're trying to do, and I think and we're doing it, so it's possible to do, and we're not a big organization. We're just a small, little thing that God's allowed us to do. But we're able to basically customize the learning experience to exactly what the participants need, in pretty close alignment to what they need. And so, as they progress through, we're creating cohorts around, okay, we have, now we have 5 people who they're at the place where they really are, their church is serious about that duplication thing becoming a reality. They've had that in their mind all along. They've already done the right stuff by creating a disciple making environment as a foundation of everything. They've already been developing leaders but they're ready now to actually begin sending leaders out to duplicate in other places. So they're going to be in a cohort with other people who are also at that place.
That's the powerful thing, guys. When you're training, those are some great questions to ask. I think the cohort model is powerful because, like Steve was saying, maybe somebody's already experienced that, but then the other people in the cohort are learning from their experience, which is a lot fresher probably than your experience or my experience. And so that's why I've really enjoyed cohorting. And I think I found once a month is great. I do once a month or once every 2 weeks. What I've also found, Steve, and I'd be interested to hear if you've seen this, I think the earlier somebody is in the process, the more they're able to meet kind of in a rhythm. So like when somebody's in that first year, generally I find it's pretty easy to meet every other week, and actually pretty beneficial and helpful because they're able to track through some of that stuff quicker. But then all of a sudden the church launches. And
they don't have as much time.
Every other week is a lot, but once a month is still doable because, there's more on the plate. And so keep that in mind when you're training somebody. Like the early stages, they can meet more and want to meet more so they can move quicker.
That's absolutely true. Yeah. I'm going to, and so, yes, I totally agree with that. And so you want to kind of flex. And I mean, if you don't have as many people showing up as time goes on, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just they're getting busy and they don't have as much need. And so that's another thing, is just don't put people on a guilt trip. Just make it available. One thing we always do is record everything. So even if they can't be part of it, because stuff happens, life happens, and you just can't always, even if you have good intentions. So the cool thing is we always record everything, just like you're doing with this. And then we send it to the people who were invited to that particular conversation. And at the very least, they get to listen to, other people talk about it. So now I want to sort of, I know we have to wrap this up. I want to throw a curveball here at the end. It's going to sound like I'm contradicting everything sort of that I just said.
I'm too curious not to hear this.
So I kind of gave the impression that I think that these big gatherings, like that one size fits all gathering, is a bad thing. And I don't want to leave the impression that I think it is. I actually think that an organization, it would actually be a good thing, maybe once a year, to just have a big gathering where everybody's invited to come, regardless of where you're at on the spectrum, whether you've actually already started a church or whether you don't even know if you're supposed to start a church. But it's just designed to be a great big fun event that actually kind of replaces, in a way, it replaces the boot camp. And so the problem with the boot camp was we were trying to do too much in too short a time, and so we need to spread that out. But there's one thing about the boot camp that we don't want to lose, and that's that just getting a whole bunch of people together and getting all pumped up and all that kind of stuff. And that's part of what happens at the boot camp. And I think, if I were in charge of every organization in the world, pretend like I'm God for a day. What I would say is, hey, let's have a huge church multiplication or church planting or whatever your language wants to be, church duplication party every year, and make it the biggest, best, funnest thing, and have, the great, but the purpose of the event is to get people excited about participating in this process that we're talking about. The takeaway from the event, we want it to be, man, I'm going to be absolutely insane if I don't participate in one of these cohorts, because we just make the point of how valuable this whole process is. So we actually energize people around the idea of being active and committed participants in this cohorting process, and just realize it's going to be longer. It definitely be longer than 4 days. It'll be, maybe 4 years, but it'll be really 4 powerful years, and will protect you from all kinds, not protect you, will lower the possibility and the probability that you're going to fall in a hole.
Well, and I think too, I love the big event thing for the networking purposes, to be able to connect with people
Yep.
you normally be able to connect with, because
Yep.
there's experts in an area, or people that have learned a ton in an area that you normally couldn't just, pick up
Yep.
the phone and connect with. I mean, Steve and I got connected through a network
That's
event
right.
setting.
That's right.
And because I had a friend, Ben, who knew Steve, lived in a similar area, and he's like, you two guys should connect. And it's been just a really great thing. And so we definitely
Absolutely.
don't want to dismiss that. But I
Right.
think the other thing it gives you, and the thing that the cohorts really give you, is it keeps you off the island. And I think church planting is unique enough, and I experienced this for the first year and a half of planting, that you feel like you're the only one experiencing the trials and challenges you experience. And one of the greatest ways an enemy takes somebody out is by getting them off by themselves. And
Right.
in a cohort, you begin to realize that even though these feel unique to you, these challenges, they're not unique.
Right. Right.
They're a common experience. And that oftentimes is that little extra fuel you need to be able to get through the challenge. And
Right.
so what I would tell you is this: if you're watching this, if you're looking for some kind of training, connect with Steve. You can connect with myself. We've got training cohorts that we put together and can help you get connected. And then also, if you're a network leader and you want to figure out how to get a training process going, or partner to be able to get some training going, talk to Steve, talk to myself. We're happy to help you with that. But what I would tell you is, when I look back on my own church planting experience, thanks to guys like Steve, I was a huge beneficiary of somebody training me. And the reason I like to train other guys is because I like to pay that forward, for lack of a better term, because there are so many mistakes I didn't make. So many things I was able to do because I was able to stand on the shoulders of somebody else that took the time to train. And so if you're training, that's one of the biggest things you're doing, is you're giving somebody the advantage of standing on your shoulders, to not have to make some of the same mistakes. So I do love that. I think that's huge.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I agree 1,000%. It's you get way more out of it than the people you're training do, because it's so enriching to you to go through that process, and you save other people a lot of pain. I do want to inject one last thought. We sort of danced around this slightly, but I think it's an important thought. Is and maybe I'm talking more to the people who are in charge of training. I think it's important. There's been a good shift. I think it needs to continue away from model-based. You could do this cohort idea and build it around a model, but increasingly there's going to need to be a lot of different kinds of guiding models. And so I would just urge everybody to make sure that the content is built around the principles, and then, the follow-up is built around applying the principles versus following, painting by number or whatever it is.
I'm so glad you brought this up. It's worth the extra time to talk about. This is actually one of my big things. We built our entire training around that philosophy. And because, the principles of church planting transcend culture. They're transferable. Yeah. They're what you call first article principles. They're just the way we're wired. I like the Simon Sinek's Why, How, What is a phenomenal video. They're the kind of principles we're talking about that you should be training people in are why principles. Right. They're principles that really drive what's going on, so you can pull them outside of model culture. Right. They're just things that are common to the church planting experience. And I think exactly if you build your training around that, to give you a quick example, when we started our new training group here in New Jersey, we had one guy who was planting in Hoboken and one guy who ended up planting a bilingual church plant. On the surface, they couldn't be two more different models of planting, yet they trained through the same process. They learned the same core competencies, and both guys are moving forward just incredibly well. And doing really unique works in the area they're in, even though they sat through and learned the same things, because it was a why-based, first article principle-based training that really didn't say, hey, this is the model and the way to do it. Because if we did that, we would have handicapped one or the other. Instead of saying, here's the principles you need, how do they apply to the people you're trying to reach?
Absolutely. That is so important. It is, and I think that's a good way to put it, is when you train to one model, you handicap somebody. I mean, it's just becoming more and more likely that 20 years ago, we had nothing. Then we had a model, and that was better than nothing. Yeah. But the beauty is what we're talking about right now, principle-based, structured conversation-based cohort, all those things. That is where the future lies in terms of the best training modality that's going to be effective in helping us partner with Jesus on his mission to seek and save that which is lost. That's so Selah.
Well, Steve, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your wisdom. It's just incredible being able to sit down and talk to Steve. And just kind of learn from his experience. If you guys need help with this, please do reach out. You can reach out to Steve at the Urban Islands Project. You can reach out to myself at the Kairos Network. We'll include those links in the follow-up. We'd love to help you, figure out how to build your own training or even partner with you in training. So we're really looking forward to connecting up with you guys. Stay attached to the emails, because we'll let you know when future webinars are coming out. And of course, if you want to catch any of these past webinars, go to www.lifeofachurchplanter.com and you can see all those webinars, this side right here, or you can download the Kairos Network mobile app. So Steve, thank you so much. And until next time, I'm Matt Peoples. It's great hanging out with you right here on Life of a Church Planter.